Some people plant for the shade they'll one day rest under. Others plant for a world they'll never see, and somehow they end up changing it forever. Make sure to subscribe, where we share stories that remind us what it means to be human. Now let's begin. The story begins in a small wind-worn town that smelled faintly of soil after rain, the kind of place where time seemed to rest between the hills. It wasn't much more than a scattering of old houses, a church bell that no longer worked, and a single road that curved like an unspoken memory through fields of golden weeds. And on the edge of that road lived Martha Ellery, the old woman the children called the keeper of the hill. She was the kind of old whose silence had weight, not fragile but firm like tree bark weathered by seasons. Every morning just after the mist lifted, people would see her walking with a cane in one hand and a small burlap bag in the other. Inside the bag were seeds. No one knew where she got them. Some said she ordered them by post from a catalog decades out of print. Others whispered she found them in the pockets of her late husband's old coat, a man who once dreamed of growing an orchard before the war took him. She never said. She would walk to the dry field by the old road, land that belonged to no one and everyone, and kneel slowly, painfully, pressing her hands into the soil. Then with deliberate gentleness she'd plant a seed, one at a time. Some days the townsfolk would stop and ask her what she was doing. Planting trees, she'd say simply, brushing the dirt from her palms. But you'll never see them grow, a man once told her. She looked up with a soft smile, her voice calm as wind through leaves. Then I'll have given someone else something to see. They laughed kindly, not mockingly, just with that gentle disbelief people carry when faced with quiet acts of faith. The children thought she was strange. The adults thought she was lonely. And Martha, she simply kept planting. That winter snow fell earlier than usual. The road froze and the fields turned white. Still people saw her walking, wrapped in her faded green coat, leaving behind footprints like breadcrumbs of devotion. Once the postman stopped beside her truck and asked, "You really think these trees will survive, ma'am?" Martha's hands trembled as she covered another hole in the frozen ground. "If not the first ones," she said, "then maybe the next." Her fingers were thin, marked by years of sewing, cleaning, and waiting for letters that stopped coming long ago. No one knew she'd once been a teacher in that same town, that she'd taught half the people who now passed her on their way to work. They didn't know she'd buried her husband beneath the oldest oak in the churchyard, the only tree still standing there. Maybe that's why she planted. Maybe she wasn't just growing trees, maybe she was growing memory. One spring morning a boy named Tommy Callan, 12, barefoot, curious, followed her to the field. He'd seen her every day on his walk to school, and curiosity had finally gotten the better of him. He crouched nearby watching her dig. "Why do you do that?" he asked suddenly. She paused, the sunlight painting gold across her white hair. "Because someone once told me," she said softly, "that hope needs a place to grow." He frowned. "But what if no one remembers you?" She smiled at the boy, the kind of smile that was more like forgiveness than joy. "Then the trees will." And that was the first time she let anyone help her. Tommy picked up a handful of seeds, clumsy but eager, and dropped them in the hole she dug. He'd go home later that day, dirt on his knees and something new in his chest, a quiet feeling he didn't yet have words for. As weeks passed, the field began to change. Little sprouts appeared, stubborn and bright against the stubborn earth. The townsfolk noticed but didn't speak of it much. They had their lives, their bills, their storms. But the old woman, she watered them every morning. Whispered to them too, though no one ever heard what she said. Once when Tommy asked, she only chuckled. Trees listen better than most people. He didn't understand then, but he would someday. And from that spring forward, the field was no longer empty. It had become something else. A promise she'd never see fulfilled, but believed in anyway. Summer rolled into the valley like a warm sigh. The field shimmered under the sun, and the once bare patch of earth where Martha planted her seeds now pulsed with fragile green life. Tiny saplings reached for the sky, trembling in the wind like young voices learning to speak. She walked among them each morning, her cane tapping against the dirt, her breath slow but sure. Sometimes she'd pause, rest her hand on a sapling, and whisper something no one could hear, something between prayer and conversation. Tommy followed her almost every day that summer. He'd grown used to her quietness, the way she spoke more with her eyes than her voice. She'd bring him lemonade and old biscuits from a tin, and together they'd sit under the sky that never seemed to end. One afternoon when the clouds were low and heavy, Tommy asked what everyone else was too polite to say. "Miss Martha, why do you plant so many? You already have trees by your house." She smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Because when I was your age," she said, "someone planted a tree for me." He looked puzzled. "Who?" Her eyes softened. Not with tears but with something heavier. "Memory. My husband. Henry." The name seemed to change the air around her. Even the wind went quiet for a moment. Henry Ellery had been a young man with laughter like sunlight, one of those people who made small towns feel bigger just by dreaming out loud. He'd met Martha when she was 19, standing outside the local post office, holding a letter she'd never sent. He had offered her a flower he'd picked from the roadside. A small yellow bloom, nothing special, and said, "Every seed wants a home." That line stuck with her all her life. They married in the church on the hill and spent most of their years tending to a small garden behind their cottage. Henry loved trees, not because they were useful but because they outlived him. "A tree doesn't rush," he'd say. "It grows because it trusts the rain will come." When the war began, he left with a promise that he'd come back to plant the orchard he'd always talked about. He didn't. A letter arrived instead, brittle and stained. It said he'd been brave. It said he'd saved others. It said he wouldn't be coming home. That spring, Martha planted a single acorn behind their house, the only one Henry had left in a small jar on his desk. She watched it grow for years. It became tall, wide, and unshakable. And beneath its shade, she buried what was left of her letters to him. Now every tree she planted was for him. And for everyone who'd loved and lost something that never came back. One evening, as the sky burned orange and violet, Tommy found Martha sitting by that old oak behind her house, the one that towered over her roof like a guardian. Her hands were folded in her lap, her face peaceful but far away. "You miss him," Tommy said gently. She smiled, the corners of her mouth trembling. "I do. But missing is its own kind of love, isn't it?" He nodded, not quite understanding, but the truth of it sank somewhere deep inside him anyway. That autumn, the town began to notice the change. The field at the edge of the road had become a young grove. Dozens of saplings stood in uneven rows, a living memorial that stretched as far as the eye could see. People started calling it Martha's Field. Some said it was foolish, she was too old, the soil too dry, the future too uncertain. But others began to bring her water, compost, even seedlings from their own gardens. It started small. A widow from the next street over bringing an apple seedling in a cracked pot. Then a farmer whose wife had passed left 2 oak saplings by her gate. Even the children began dropping in seeds they found along the road, whispering as if the act itself was sacred. Tommy, now 13, kept a small notebook where he drew every new tree they planted. Next to each he wrote a name. "For my mother," one said. "For the teacher who believed in me." For no reason at all, just because. When he showed it to Martha, she smiled through tears. "You've made a forest of memories," she whispered. "You did that," he said. "No," she replied softly. "We all did." Then came the storm. Late one night, thunder cracked over the valley, and the wind howled like something alive. Rain tore through the field, bending the young trees to the ground. Tommy ran to Martha's house through the downpour, heart hammering, afraid she might be out there trying to save them. He found her at her window, watching the storm with a look of quiet sorrow. "They'll break," he cried. She turned to him, her voice calm even as lightning flashed behind her. "Maybe. But some will bend and learn to stand taller." He didn't understand it that night. But in the morning, when the sun rose over the drenched earth, half the saplings still stood. And beside the fallen ones, new seeds had already begun to sprout. It was then that Tommy realized, the old woman wasn't just planting trees. She was teaching people how to keep faith in things they might never see. And in that realization, something in him shifted. He began to believe too. Years passed quietly in the town by the hill. The seasons rolled in and out like the tide, carrying time with them, unseen, unstoppable. The saplings grew into young trees. Their branches reached higher each spring, weaving a green canopy that shimmered in the sunlight. The once empty field had become a place of peace. A hush fell over it, the kind that only grows where something sacred takes root. The townspeople began walking there in the evenings. Lovers carved initials into bark, children chased each other between trunks, and the old came to sit beneath the shade, whispering memories to the wind. No one questioned it anymore. It was simply there, part of their lives, part of their sky. And at the heart of it all was Martha Ellery, smaller now, slower, her steps more careful. But her eyes still carried that quiet fire that seemed to know something everyone else forgot. That small acts done with love never truly stay small. Tommy had grown too. At 17, he was taller than Martha, with hands that bore the same dirt-stained proof of care. He helped her every morning, tending to the young grove as though it were a shared secret. He'd started taking pictures of the trees, old Polaroids that faded around the edges but caught light in their centers. One day, while pinning a new photo to Martha's wall, he noticed the dozens already hanging there, each one labeled in her neat, looping handwriting. Oak, planted with Tommy, May 1968. Elm, planted after the storm, survived. Apple for the children. Ash for Henry. And one taped near her bedside. The last one for whoever needs it most. He smiled and asked, "Who's that one for?" She looked at him with tired eyes and whispered, "Maybe you'll know when it's time." The following year, her health began to wane. Her hands trembled too much to dig. Her walks grew shorter. But even when she couldn't plant, she'd still visit the grove. She'd sit in the same wooden chair Tommy carried for her and close her eyes, listening to the leaves murmur above her, the sound of hundreds of living memories breathing together. One afternoon she spoke softly to him, her voice barely above the rustle of branches. "When I go, Tommy, promise me you'll keep planting." He swallowed hard, trying to hide the ache in his throat. "Don't talk like that. You're not going anywhere." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried more truth than comfort. "We all go somewhere. But if you plant something before you leave, you never really go alone." He wanted to say something back, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he took her hand and held it until the sun went down. That winter was cold, the kind that made the air sharp and the nights long. The trees stood tall through it, their branches bare but unbroken. And on a quiet February morning, Martha Ellery passed away in her sleep, peacefully like a candle finishing its light. The town fell still. For the first time in decades, the road by the hill seemed empty. The sound of her cane tapping against the ground gone. But when spring came again, something remarkable happened. Tiny seedlings began appearing in places she had never planted. At the foot of fences, along the ditches, beside the church, even behind the school. No one knew how they'd gotten there. Some said birds had carried them. Others believed it was the wind. Tommy didn't say anything. He just smiled because he knew. The townsfolk held a small service beneath the oldest oak behind her cottage, the one she'd planted with her husband's acorn. The same tree now towered over them, roots deep and branches wide, its leaves whispering like an old soul. Tommy stood at the front, clutching one of her seed bags. When the service ended, he walked to the open field at the grove's edge, the only patch that remained untouched. He dug a hole, placed a seed inside, and whispered, "This one's for you." Then, as if the wind itself carried her voice, he heard it again, soft, almost imagined. Hope needs a place to grow. He didn't cry. Not right away. He just stayed there, watching the light shift through the trees she'd never sat under, realizing that she'd left behind something far greater than a memory. She'd left a home for hope. Over the years, the grove became a landmark. People from nearby towns came to see it, the Ellery Grove they called it now. Teachers brought students there to learn about ecology, kindness, and legacy. Couples took wedding photos beneath its branches. Children who'd never met Martha grew up playing beneath her shade, their laughter echoing like songs of gratitude she'd never hear. And at the very center, by a small wooden sign, Tommy built a bench. It read, "In memory of Martha Ellery, who planted for tomorrow." By the time Tommy turned 40, he'd long since become what Martha once was, a quiet figure walking the same road with a burlap bag in his hand. The cane wasn't there yet, but the look in his eyes was the same, patient, believing. Sometimes he'd find children following him, asking questions just like he once had. "Why do you keep planting? they'd ask. And he'd smile, bending down to place another seed in the earth. Because someone once taught me that the best shade you'll ever rest under is the one you plant for someone else. But one day a reporter came to town, from a city far away, to write about the woman who planted hope. He asked Tommy, "Do you ever wish she'd lived to see this forest?" Tommy looked out over the grove, the wind rippling through thousands of leaves like whispers of gratitude. "She didn't need to," he said softly. "She already saw it here." He placed a hand over his chest. Some people see further than their years. Time like wind moves in whispers. And though the years had softened the edges of the town, the grove remained, vast and alive, a living cathedral of green that stretched toward the horizon. Children who once played beneath its saplings were now parents themselves. They brought their little ones here, not because they knew Martha Ellery, but because the place felt good, peaceful, sacred in a way no one could quite explain. The sunlight filtered through branches that had outgrown memory itself, painting the ground with patterns that shifted like stories retold by the earth. At the entrance stood a weathered wooden sign, "The Ellery Grove. For those who plant what they'll never see." It had been repainted countless times, each brushstroke from a different pair of hands, each act a small echo of gratitude. Tommy Callan, now older, slower, with silver threading through his hair, stood beneath the tallest oak. It had grown so wide he could barely wrap his arms around it. He still carried the same burlap bag, patched and faded. Inside were seeds, oak, maple, elm, even wildflowers, collected from the grove itself. Each time he dropped one into the soil it felt like passing the torch. But today he wasn't alone. Beside him stood his daughter Lucy, no older than 10. She knelt beside him, small hands digging into the dirt. "Why do we plant more, Papa?" she asked. He smiled softly, the same way Martha once had. "Because there's always room for more trees." She tilted her head. "But the forest is already full." He looked around at the endless rows of green, the rustle of leaves above. "It's not about filling space," he said. "It's about leaving something good behind." Lucy thought for a moment, pressing the seed into the ground with her thumb. "Like stories." He chuckled quietly. "Exactly like stories." That evening as dusk fell, Tommy walked through the grove alone. The air smelled of moss and rain, that familiar grounding scent that always reminded him of her. The path wound deeper, until it opened into a clearing he hadn't visited in years. At its center stood the first tree she ever planted, the one the children once laughed at, the one she'd pressed into dry soil with trembling hands. Now it was enormous, branches stretching toward the clouds, roots deep enough to hold the weight of generations. He rested his palm against the trunk. The bark was rough, warm from the day's sun. He could almost hear her voice again, that calm, unshakable faith. If not the first ones, then maybe the next. He smiled through a blur of tears. "You were right, Martha. You were right about everything." The next morning, the town gathered for a small ceremony, 50 years since the first seed was planted. A brass plaque was unveiled beneath the great oak. It read, "In memory of Martha Ellery, who taught us that kindness grows roots." The mayor spoke, children sang, and somewhere in the back of the crowd, an old man wiped his eyes without shame. Lucy tugged at her father's sleeve. "Do you think she knows?" Tommy knelt down beside her, looking out over the grove where sunlight danced like gold between the leaves. "Maybe not like we do," he said. "But every time the wind moves through these trees, it's her way of saying she's still here." Years later, when Tommy was gone too, the grove still stood. People came from cities to see it. Artists, writers, travelers, lovers. Some sat quietly beneath the branches and wept without knowing why. Others left small notes tied with string to the roots of trees. "For my father. For my child. For someone I miss." And in spring, when the blossoms came, they painted the ground in color so bright it felt like the earth itself was celebrating what one life, one choice, had begun. A century after the first seed, the town had changed. Roads were paved. Buildings rose. The world had moved on faster, louder, more digital than ever. But the Ellery Grove remained untouched. It had become something more than land. A living story passed from voice to voice, a reminder that kindness doesn't disappear. It just takes root in new soil. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, people said they could hear a soft tapping sound along the path, like a cane against the earth. Followed by a whisper. Hope needs a place to grow. The camera slowly pulls back, the narrator's voice fading to a gentle close, the trees stretching across the horizon like a green ocean of memory. Some people plant for shade they'll sit under. Others plant for those they'll never meet. But in the end, we all live in the forest someone else began. If stories like this touch your heart, make sure to subscribe to Vault of Tales, where we share stories that remind us what it means to be human.